may have remembered me from last year when we were teaching virtually, and maybe in 2019 when I taught. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. My expertise is in human neuroimaging. So I work a lot with MRI and fMRI.
Tanda ngi la Jeremy Sigis chichi bana nga su che chunga Tembasun Chorus nanya nga su tathon su stamba the 3 years tingo la ni to chugulo bana ya the 2 years nga bana cheliti ani de yes ro nginze wansa seru ba chor wa tinda yes tal leka su che te lepa par jaga chor wa o te ge leka te chi yes.
And so I use MRI and fMRI to understand the function in the brain. And my particular focus has been trying to understand how the brain represents written language and memories.
Written language or what
And so along with my research program, I have done a lot of teaching on brain navigation and working with brain files. And this is what we'll be going over in large part today. So on the Google Classroom site for today, I posted this document that has these resources that could be useful for you to use, and we'll use at least a couple of them with examples today.
Google Class Google Class na yes roa te karlana chisula peche tong ge ko ge yes ane de na ne kha chi ane tera nga su peche tong de ane karsa pichong kha shingu yes.
And here are some videos that I've recorded. They're in English, but at some point hopefully we'll be able to translate those and they could be a more practical resource for you.
So for
I want to emphasize that today I'm just introducing these resources, but please, we can set up a way for you to reach out to me, reach out to us, so that you could to figure out better ways for you to use these resources, for you to get additional input about how to use them. And so keep in mind, we're just introducing them, and then hopefully in the future, you will reach out to us and we could help improve the way you use them.
Jucha data chesula ngutu chigi zamro ata ngutu chigi yores ni chesu ge jima bana ta de kanda special tangu yeme ta dilel hap yeme ta chior wata ani chesula ya pecho ta tab du ta tena do yanga chete ani nga chula ya tro tu zero chis ta so de maung wala ya chesu de to pecho ta be kapsa pecho ta chocho chita pecho ta tab du yanga chorwa wa tena do ze chete yes.
So for today, we can kind of give an example of the way you might set up your a particular class that you're teaching. And an important aspect of that is the learning objectives. So these are ones that we had translated last year, and so we can follow along with them.
다 대령 가서 될라야 안에 전자디 값을 가서 전자 지트고요. 와 트피 값을 가나로 지기 요메게 와 방는 중으로 지기 단데 나닐로 주스탄발라 코주샤요리스타 담보테 임바나 가서게 안에 니마 따랑 기타 다 소탄데게 론생게 무기 가림 바튼 거로 지샤예스.
And so the important objectives are to better understand how to navigate in the brain in 3 dimensions. Because a lot of what you've seen have just been 2-dimensional images. So one important thing we'll go over is to interact at 3 dimensions.
다 단다 데나네 무기치 카레레스 담발랑 가수가 레파가나라 뉴스스가 다 레파가 나바카토요 바티 타탄테레스 다 단다기 데라야 가수게 디란즈다나 지야데 레파타 쇼차 심다고와 총이 선댕게 레파라야 간다스다고요 바티데시 자게인스 다 단다 버던 가수가 버통야데 총이 지된 그 퍼창차 타레스 레파콜라.
And so these are navigation terms, so we'll go over this 3-dimensional space, so we're oriented to what that is, and then we'll go over these navigation terms that Michael was talking about earlier this morning.
다 단다 담보들라야 가수가 쇼응이 선댄스 담발라야 가수가 다 쿠게 쇼당야나 거이도 스미어와 어디다데 간라요 바테타레스 니 셴다데 가수가 다 가수그레 지금 레팔라도 스타스 담발라야 아니 티탄 데비게 츠키 셴다 카르게 타탄 올라 소바게 츠키 거와 티타 카레 임바데 당게 응엘라야 게 마이클 아긴 젠다 고마텔레 치송스.
And then with this navigation, we want to identify specific structures that are important from an anatomical and functional perspective. And so we'll go through some of these.
다 소시지야라야 개첨부 임바게 츠근데 딱 배치당 대당 가수가 레파그나라야 아니 고 젤레다 디기타니 개첨부 임바이 초코 커치라야 가sun도 스타기엔스.
So the software that I like to use is called MRI Cron, and this is when you open it, it opens a brain file that you can navigate in 3 dimensions.
다 단다 데랑아 타야 가요 바데 단다게 타젠디 인스탄티 카시바 임바나 타젠데 나라야 초랑 갈레파그 파칭도 스토용 그레스 tatingane lepag party la tene tanga so lepag party la ya shochak sendeng ngola ya dustat kres.
I could if that would be easier. Yeah, yeah. So this is right here in the document that I mentioned on the Google Classroom. This is the software, and here's a link to download it, for instance. So there's other software here. So I want to point out anything that we're using or looking at, the links will be in that the Google document.
Tanda Google Class na chisha dwa te tanda trato te yores te dignane ko gala ya de thosten shajo de ko shajo kro ta ga su phalban ji saglam tinda yes.
So the first thing that we're going to go over is discuss viewing the brain in these 3 dimensions.
Ta tambu te la ga su karching se na lepa te la ya shocha sendeng ngo ni tabi kap su kan stagyo meten de shajagis.
And so what we mean by that is that here are these 3 slices, or the 3 orientations. And let's bring up the
tanda de la ga su ga lepa ge tandevi slices siguro ta per smius.
So we have the different views that were mentioned earlier this morning with the coronal, the horizontal, also called axial, and the sagittal.
Ta de ga su ga lepa la ya chi ta shaya ge shogor dorwa tis tambala ya tada du sta tambala ya ku chi share ani theshare ani shinsha ke namba ge par jusum res.
So does anybody know what this orientation is?
Tanda gang de ga du sa sagittal.
Sagittal, right? And this one?
Gang de ga du sa coronal right. Chisha coronal.
The coronal, correct. And then, of course, this one,
Horizontal.
the horizontal.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. So, as it's static like this, it's relatively straightforward. But now we can move around in 3 dimensions.
Tanda dire ro bana da ko ta ko ngus seli lau do wa tanda de che la nga so kar du gen sana ne ta shong is mdeng na bala du yes.
And so one thing I like to do is to say start on the top of the brain and then navigate in one direction. So we're going to start at the superior. So let me go over these markers here. This S means superior.
Tadi tanda dir wa tanda nga so de kadar ta gen shong is mdeng la ta bi kap se nga so ni chi gen gu zu de ta ma du gen tanda de ba na gang de ta ma du er do wa tanda de la S to say to superior system bala ya tang ro do wa.
This P means posterior.
De P se de jab dir do wa.
And this L is left.
Da de la ya yok de gana L chi do L de ga yuen te go res.
And so, of course, this being posterior over here is anterior.
That P you said de jab bana se jok sa den den ro wa.
And then down here would be inferior.
Da de wo cha ro wa.
And so these are markers, they're guides to help us in our navigation.
Da tanda de ka system nga so le pala du shong se den ga ta ki kap se tanda ki ts kha chi do ga de nga so la ya kha sho ka ye me chi ro wa de to ya ge chon tak diris.
One additional marker that is actually an interesting detail that researchers use a lot is these coordinates, where there's specific numbers here, X, Y, Z.
Da tanda de ka se na da jenda chi nga so de le chon tak jenda chi res chon tak jenda de ka system ba nga so ge so shin chi ro so shin gang ge tang ka chon ya de res da chon ka de na de la ya le ko tan ta do ma shi de re do wa. Chongore sena de tak nga suge da sokshan x na y z or wa sokshan tizu ge tangkat songyores.
So I'm selecting this particular region and I'm just kind of moving around, and you can see in the sagittal plane, and you can see the coronal and the axial changing in what slice I'm going through.
Da de ta gela de la ya ku da ta de sha de ta ku tan de ge kasa ko la chimba ba na nga su la ya ta chu sha da the sha ke ye le pa ge cha shi ge par de la jwa du do.
You'll also notice that the numbers are changing, right? Because it's different coordinates.
That is the bala tim se chirong ki kari na tranga tangi tranga khasi chila sa tranga la yan ko didu.
And so I bring this up because it's actually very important for researchers to have this coordinate system. So if I'm studying the brain, and I'm really interested in something that's right here, I think that there's a function right here. I could publish that and say something in this coordinate, -8, 43, 43, is associated with heightened awareness. And then a researcher, such as Jillian, could read that and look at her brain and determine if that matches what she finds in her experiments.
이게 장가치고 저거 총했음 된게 좀 가사 소상심 당대비 딱고 대화 당하게 장가치고 사태 당대비 장가치고 와데 아니 심지그 값게 잡으자고 그래서 피차샤바나 나랑 그 심지치치데 심지치치데 다다데라 독마제 독마제 세심이 주게 아니 네텔라야 아니 고 셀린데 당대와게 레파게 차시티 둘라바나 나랑 그 티나도 치게 세녀지 Jide the collection each trip by Bana, again Jilang getting at Tosachigo Bana, more lopalo pig, the lepage Persi or Tilatin data, than the Sachati, and Chilitan or Rindum to say Tilatires.
And so this is important, or one way to think about navigating the brain and working with these files is that we have these markers, we have these navigation kind of directions that are analogous to north, south, east, west, so superior, inferior, posterior, anterior, but also analogous to meters. There's an actual distance associated with these coordinates. So we are mapping things that we might use for two-dimensional navigation with a map, and we use the same principles for navigating into the 3 dimensions.
Namjinga su chalon dus tambala khashok so kar sa share lo national la suba tangu yorwa tela kunan ko res tin singe dela ya ga chu ga ya ko cho kangela ya ane tanga katsore do sa te ya namjinga su ge ne ko meter la samna ta ro ante ne du bet meter din re sha sa chu wa tin na singe ga su ta de ta ga su namje sabtala tabi kapsa satala ta de tandus tambala ya chungi ni deng satanga ta go yorwa tin ane kanda do chin ru go yo me chi yorwa o ti chba ta ne de ko dasung cha grace.
And so I think for this, we're going to take a moment. I think it might be good to, if we can bring the table up here, so we can, I think that could be useful. So would you give us just a moment? You guys are awesome. Thank you. So notice in the brain that we don't, so a lot of what we'll be going over today, we're not going to have a lot of the colors that you typically see. So one important thing to teach neuroanatomy is good to be able to understand what the structures are and identify important landmarks in the brain itself, independent of the coloring and the labeling. There are resources for doing that, so it's important to use those materials to learn it. But I think in order to teach it well, it's good to be able to navigate around using important structures. For instance, what is this structure?
Should I translate or ask the question?
Ask the question.
Hippocampus is there. Hippocampus. I think that's the hippocampus.
This is not the hippocampus. Yeah. So this is in, so I'm going to ask you a few, structures. So we'll start here. But it's important to keep in mind the view that we're looking at. This is the sagittal. Yeah. So this is this view, remember? And this is in the middle. And we know that, so you can see here in the coronal view, this is cutting through the middle of these 2 orientations, right? And so this is called the mid-sagittal slice. So we'll say that it's not unreasonable to say that this is the hippocampus, because it's one of what I call C-shaped structures. And so this structure is, I'll give you an additional hint, it's white matter. Yes. Yep. There you go. Good. And so it has, one thing, it's good when considering brain navigation, identifying these structures, to find a good view to which clearly identifies it. And so here you can see this C-shaped structure. It's kind of like this. So that's very characteristic of the corpus callosum. This is the white matter tract that connects the two hemispheres.
Tale samge kuge chashiti ngosu topu yong do ate ga thle tanda karji ki tris do ate karsena lepa ki tumchin japan sulaya ta da tangsa gi chashiti ro tis tambalaya ko sig zuta yo pakan shilaya ani ku ma khama khol jur go number shitoga. Should I translate? I will translate the part that you mentioned before you asked the question.
Okay.
Okay, like a little bit briefly. Danda digging well, Trati Matongola did somebody carries a Trati Matongola Yatati Gelag Mabuch Sons, Teta Dodo Shiba in Bana, Tanda digger Mudita, Shopagar Mutuan Shella Capriores, Karchila Bana, Lepag Chachis Hamalaya, Centrata Yomares, Tachisugi, Chimalaya, near Dinado, Chungisum Dinado, Lepag Chachitagus Tambalaya, and it's Centrala Matem Bigoni, and Saguris. So Centrala Matem Bigoni, Helaya, Tapsiores, the Careses Tambalanaya, Lepaganane, Chashi, and Kashike Chambu, Kugazuta, Tingichen Tinayoroa, Tindanguzim Bigoni, and the Yashanga Lepag Chashit in the Munzag, Tapsitiores, Tikasim Bana, and Tindado, Juchata, Chitunchen Tinayore, or Tindaya Kalakalamutuchi. Yes. Yes.
So it's important to emphasize that where we are, this is where this crosshair is. So if I click around, this is where we are. So as we navigate, we'll be moving this crosshair.
Laya dusta tabi kapsus chorang ko yopati hakugu yores ta tanda yopati gelagi tanda ta takti jasa stoka oti resto ngasu tanda yosa to ala yore tani ni ngasu yama ne lepag chashendra tag yores.
So now I go here. Did I go superior, inferior, left, right, anterior?
Tanda di bana kola drosons tanga so yola droson yela droson gala droson ola droson dala droson jabla drosons frontal to the front.
I went to the frontal.
Yeah.
But in terms of navigation, where did I go? Did I go north, northeast, southwest? Did I go anterior, posterior, inferior?
Anterior, right.
Yes,
anterior, yeah.
right. Yes. And so these, we're trying to get a sense for the navigation.
That decal system balaya any chigata tanishi chiwasagor dustam balaya kasho tentang yes.
And now up here,
Delando bina karchisonsa superior.
and went superior, right? Okay, good. Good. And then all the way down here, inferior. Okay. All right. Yep.
Oh, that the auto alena caules.
Inferior. Yep.
Inferior.
I heard inferior. Yep. Okay. All right. So we can turn. It's easy. It's relatively easy to start with one particular orientation and kind of navigate around. It gets a bit more challenging when you're trying to combine all of the different orientations. So we can switch to another orientation here. So here in the coronal.
That under the Maragasu Chicasa, the Tamputilla Nasugata, the Shinshla Rala Shisha, the Tangasutago, or this Tambalaya, near top duties to your Kutairoa, Chashi Casaqua by Banata, Tangasugi de la Yaco, Sharaga numbers Mustoa, Nyam to day by Banatis Calicapo, that under the Capsanga de la Tagiensta. Tamputi Pajoka Jishasati Pajote corner, Tangasu de Chishatela Shisha de Tatagiens.
So, where is this? What structure is this?
Tigaresa. corpus callosum.
That's right. So this is one view of it, but one advantage of looking at the different slices at the same time is that you can see what it looks like in this case, the coronal view.
Da da nga su ga yang ko ge nye mando la ya shu mando ta ki son de ka reses tam bala ya nga su dus ta ba na thon na shi ta ya pha jo ko ta da ta sa ge rumu ge ta da ta ko jito ta no to yo sa chi ko ro wa de ta da lesson rang ro wa.
So here you can see the the connection, how it connects between the different hemispheres, which isn't as clear in the sagittal view.
Da da de ge shin sha la ta ba ba na shin sha kap sa nga su ge lesson te ge le pa ge dum shin sha de thu pa de ngo su do bu thong mo do wa e ba na pha jo ko de ga ta ba na chu sha ko de la ta ba na ne nga su ge ka su ge le pa ge dun shin sha de lesson ju ji da thu yo pa de dus thong dus.
Okay, so I'm going to move here. Which direction did I move in?
Ta na ge la chi do so ka la do so shok shok ka so la do so tsigardu left.
Oops.
Tsidua de la L chidua.
Correct, left.
Yeah, I shola do L dua bhaju te ko tensha dua.
There. Yeah. So we have the markers again that you can look at.
Da de la ya ko san to te dua de la tana digro.
And so we can also look here in the axial view.
Da shenda ga su ke thesha kana ba de ga tana digres.
And so again from the corpus callosum.
Da de ga su ke lesson derwa.
Click down here. Which direction did I go?
Da dus do ba na sho ka wala do so sa. Posterior.
Posterior, that's right. Okay. And so it'll take some practice in order to, depending on which slice you're in terms of going anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, in order to understand which direction you're going in.
Da nga su ge chi ya per la ro per la mando la shisha de ta persum se ro per la mando la shisha de ta nga su gala do tala do wala do ani do la do jala do se ti lam sa ha ko la ye jonder kala ka su gu res.
Okay, so now we can focus on some of the structures. And I'll go to a particular structure, and you can tell me what it is.
Da ni nga su chakko ngi chen kha chila ta ge yes ni nga chakko chila do de ta chakko te ka la ya ani dus tens ta bala che su chakko te ka re me ngoto chiro chis.
And so we'll focus on lobes, so the major structures that we went over earlier this morning. And so keep in mind the navigation directions that we're going in.
Da di chiro chis shopa de la nga su ge karsa de lenda bio ro lenda kha chi chembu kha chi ngoto chi sha yo ro ti ta tengis ta ti ta la tas tam bala nga su kha so to bi chi kha chi do wa o ti to sam na yo chiro chis.
So let's start with here. Which lobe is this?
Da do na gu chi is di dama karin dama rendus.
I hear a lot of occipitals. That's great. Good.
That is.
What about here?
Diga resa. Frontal. Tanda gela ge jasa chdo diga resa. Thubare. Frontal lobe.
Okay. We mix it up a bit. We are. Do. How about there?
Diga resa. Natarve. Temporal lobe. There's a temporal lobe.
Okay. So this is, I specifically chose one that was a little difficult.
Te kale khabu bachidam yes.
So here, what's this? What's this lobe right here?
Te gares.
Okay.
Yeah, te nato damatiro. That's temporal lobe,
Yeah,
right?
so here you can see the temporal, and it's going to go about right there.
Te gala
So
gare.
right above, what's just superior to the temporal lobe?
Ane ta gare re sa nato dapa gala gare re. Parietal lobe,
Yes, parietal lobe.
parietal lobe.
But good. That's if you were confused between the lobes, it would be between the parietal and the temporal, as opposed to say the occipital or the frontal.
Ta shenda ta ngasung gu karsa gu chi tupai baina chi jab tang dundap nisha gola gu ma tu pa che ngasu nato dama ta chungdap sa chi gora to kola tis tugiris.
And so there are resources. So I can add these kind of colored, in this case, you can add the lobes, which give you colors. So in some of the resources that we'll post in the Google Classroom, and so here in blue would be the parietal lobe, red would be the frontal, yellow would be the temporal, you have the cerebellum, and then the occipital.
Ta da di baina ngasu ge yang chi chonta mando ga gi tin da wo yo re swa chonta mando ga tin na ne tak ngasu ge dundap de mabu che ro chungdap de dir do karsa ngombu che ne jamde ti baina ti karsa tangdap ti baina jangku che ani natang dama ti baina kapu do do ne shenda da de la ngasu ge de lenyang tirwa du ji baina dire do yang chonta yo sa chonta ti ya chonta tangge lepa ga chonta me war mo ga la ta ya chonta yong ji gi dire do ge ko tunchin de na yo re sta ta de tan dewe ge ju chan de ta ani thatula shagos.
So these are resources to help with learning, but they're a bit of a crutch, and so it is good for you to try to learn the different structures without the colors. I'm just pointing them out that this is a resource for you to use.
Da dire do ge ko chi jang ge tunchin te yo re sim ba na charang ge jang be kap sim ba na chi ya chi chonta me be ga ne jang thna ya bo yo re.
So in terms of, for example, separating between whether you're in the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe, does anybody know the name of the sulcus that divides those lobes?
Da di teng de sa ke pisha sha ba nga su ge chungdap tang dundap chi yor wa chungdap tang dundap cha ge yuwa che ge yin sam chi yor wa di teng de sa koran ge paru la ya chi yor wa.
Di ni per.
Yeah.
Ngogyo la shen to thongso la shen.
That chi ya chi de chopa chi na de re sa.
Di paru la ngogyo la shen to thongso la shen yors. Di ni paru la.
What did they say?
They're saying that is the gap between the motor cortex and the sensory cortex that we learned in the previous class.
Yes, that's exactly it. It is the sulcus that divides the motor cortex, that band, and the somatosensory cortex.
And
so you can kind of see this. So this is the somatosensory in this particular view. So again, in the axial view, this is, so there are different views are good at visualizing some of these structures. So I'm pointing out, so it might not be obvious in, say, the coronal view, but it's easier to see in the sagittal and in the axial. So I'm pointing out this is the somatosensory gyrus, also called the post-central gyrus, that Michael brought up earlier this morning.
ku tang number mandra ko la thwa le la utin yo res ta tan din do imba na ga su ge imba na ko thwa le la do tim da ga su ge 신샤 다 현대 신샤 간에 통하도와 단다 대 간에 통하도와 바나 파조 대 간에 통하 카부데는 도 요레스 단다 대 반데 자이르스 대 포스트 센트럴 자이르스 시스템 발라야 다 지마 되게 잡록 시주 서치 거로 시주 대 데레스 다 ताना शोभा ने के मार्क लग देश जा पता करना जरेस.
And the sulcus that divides it is called the central sulcus. So, kind of was mentioned, you might imagine that's a reasonable name for a sulcus that's in the center, but it's kind of on the side here, how you might view it.
हाँ तो दादा के सबसे चुरा सब तेरियां को कीमा के सबसे दो या चिकती ता सेंट्रल सर्कस सिस्टम वाला कीमा के सब का सेगु और तो इंबाई ना या सबका तो ये तो या लेपर कीमा बच्चे दिखला कीमा लड़ दो.
So here would be the somatosensory cortex, and here would be the motor cortex that we discussed earlier this morning.
हाँ तो शोभा जीवन आशीर्वाद तांदा देला या गांसो के लेशन के नाने थोंसर तांदा कर सवांसो लेशन तां अने गुच्चो लेशन शायद रेस.
So one of the additional tools that we have is beyond looking in these different slices in 3 dimensions. There is another resource that you could download that projects things to the surface. And so a lot of the images you'll see in textbooks will have this surface view.
हाँ तो दादा देला या फाजो देला या सोचा सुनते हैं उन्हें लेपा ते कन्नड़ हो में ताये तीग गांव लाया ने लक्ष्य शेंदा चियो पर यूचे शेंदा चियो पर ते दिरेस ते दिग गांव बना गासुगा ते नामजिंग गासुगा लेपा के शिंगु के थोनाच करोवा ते कन्नड़ ये बातें तेंगे रेस देला.
And so it can be useful beyond just thinking in these slices, but also thinking about from the surface of the brain. So if you were to actually take a brain out of somebody's skull and hold it, this is what you would see. You would be seeing the actual surface of it.
हाँ तो फाजो देला या लेपा के नांग लाता है कि खोगे ता ये शुखासी करोवा ते चम माइन बा ने शेंदा बने खेती चरण लाया मुनी के लेपा ची लापला रापा बने चरण को थोंस ता बरे या अने लेपा के ता पापा ची करो शिंगी ते थोंगरेस ते देना रो थोंगरेस.
And you could, in this particular software, you can rotate it around to look at different views or at different directions.
हाँ तो तंदे दी बना ये चिंदी के नाने चले पति या मन कुछ तो देता शुक मांडो ने तंदे कोरिस.
And so here I'm in the somatosensory cortex.
हाँ तंदे दी ऐसे दी करेस इस तंबला या गासु को वांसर गलेशन दिरेस.
Does anybody want to volunteer to point at where it is on here on the surface?
हाँ तो तंदे दी कब्ज़र वादी के शिंगे तेला या अने वांसर लेशन ते कंगेर दोस. Consolation is somatosensory solution dirwa.
The pointer?
Tanya ayo sa.
Oh, yeah. This one? Just a little anterior. There we go. Yeah. Good. And so it's good. You use the cue of where going anterior. So in terms of navigating. So if I'm right here and I'm told to go more anterior, then I would go this way. So I know that this is the front of the brain. This is the back, so the posterior part of the brain.
हाँ तो दादा गेला के चिरंग के तंबू चितें सो ते जेला या खुगे ता कांगा चु खासु तें तक नने दलवा से गरो ता दन शुला दु जस नबा चु फाडो सो ओते ताता रेस ते पीछे छपे ने के तमा ओ तलो यो पे बन दलो से तम दलो दो जगा सुगे दुंदे तला ले ग्रोस.
And so the reason why I know that this is the somatosensory cortex and this is the motor cortex is in large part because of the way they're shaped. They're these parallel bands. As opposed to back here, there really isn't as clear a band. And so this is, I'm referring specifically to it being shaped like this.
Tanda dela ya yang te ngasuge surgele shi imbati kandas ngushingre sistem bala yang ngasu tela lusoga lesson te ta ane guchoga lesson te shakuran this nyamshi gungula yoris ro and round of this yoris do zutarwa this tambalaya ane tandagi te ane luso lesson ba shingres te tsujote ta ba na tsujote tan raog kurang ya tep tinamendo are mares this tambalaya tandade ane luso lesson te the lokote ane gucho lesson te chakores.
Right. And so this is, so if we were to add the colors to this view, so we know that this would be the central sulcus, dividing the pre and post central gyrus, so dividing the motor and the somatosensory. So this would be frontal, and this would be parietal.
Ke tatake takasu de la chonta ke de la bagulation de chonta no stamba imbana tandake de careses nambala kurang chig subtir do subtige ne ko kasugre takasu ke lutsor relation de tang gucho relation de yuachi che ane dunda tang singdap de yuachi ga sansan de chagores.
And so it's a little bit more difficult in the slice view to identify those, but it's the same kind of markers that we would use in terms of where the sulcus is, where the frontal lobe, where the parietal lobe would be. You just need to be able to find these parallel gyri. And you can see them right here, like that.
Tanda dege koranga chigita sukka sukurwati tongayati ani tanda wote tanganti imbana korange de ngushu relation te ta ani karsa one so relation suka luso relation te nichage barote karim batane koranji ge azukta ta bana koranji sis down over chire do anyam te do ando chidu ate dus tont grace remote ni gane.
And so the other we can talk about the temporal lobe. And so here's this fissure right here called the Sylvian fissure. And here in the slice view, I'm going to select where the Sylvian fissure is in the left hemisphere. And you can see in I'm selected here in the coronal view, you could see this fissure. And then as you go deeper inside, you can see that there's still some cortex that we can view inside the brain, deep inside the fissure.
Tanda chishok nambatela taba imbana roa tigi nane tanda asu natong dama ko ge subka chimbuch tuga tidus dela tong tudus.
And so this is a bit of a review from earlier this morning. But this, you can see these darker areas. This is the cortex where the cell bodies are. And then this white area is where the white matter is.
Tana shopan zende tribatela ya shashan shiba imbana tis sontra nabu yosati nenga suga chadzi chirwa ne sontra kapu yosati ani tanga suga karzi yosati res.
And so in the slice view, you can see that this is this Sylvian fissure that divides the frontal and the parietal from the temporal lobe.
Tanda dini nga suga koge susuk dala taba bana nga suga dendap ta ani kasa natong dama chigorwa tiku dus chapajit kdus.
And this looks very different when you look in the coronal view, but you can see here again the Sylvian fissure, and you can see this branching right here is the temporal lobe.
Tanda ge susuk nama di kapsa taba imbana ani ko natong dama te ya agenda ge parna yo patan tes manda ores ti pasula yo pati ani natong dama te chagores.
Okay. So this is an advanced question. Does anybody know what this gyrus is? And why it's important? As a hint, it's in the temporal lobe.
That chile labai bana di tanda natong damanana yoris. Siju kari sijuris. Siju kari sijurisa. Fusiform.
I'll tell you the name of it. It's called. Oh.
He says lada ke.
Facial?
No, he's
Are you saying fusiform?
fusiform gyrus. That's
That's a reasonable guess, but it's not. That's not the fusiform. It's called Heschel's gyrus. It's important for a sensory system.
Di tanda de chorn sopa je sopa yago chi son simbana di tanda nga so you sensory gyrus, right? For sensory.
Yes.
That one sort tanda yo big si ju gyrus. Tri tanda yo rwa. Gyrus de min de gare salata.
Any guess as to what sensory system?
Natsuge wanso mala karin saris. Hearing.
Hearing. Yes, this is the primary auditory cortex.
Tadi yade natsuge dirda tisuge lashin tang thoma dirdo. Tisu lashin zo diris.
And it has this very distinct shape to it in the axial view when you're in the sylvian fissure.
Tanda natsuge teshak nambala tabi imbayna kola ya ani tandagi ta siju chigoro tegi thongna tingonsu dobu yoris.
So this is associated with your inputs from your ear, so the primary auditory system. If you damage this, then you wouldn't be able to hear.
That thing natsuge tisuge elation zu chigoro tisolation tomatita do chagoro kete dela ya ani chichon do chishorba imbayna ni charangi dati kugumaris.
And so this is where the primary input is. Then, of course, the entire a large part of the temporal lobe is associated with processing complex auditory inputs.
Ta tandagi chashite tandanga suge tisirculation tatsu sena tomatiro wata tangputi kugi isachi sarwati ane shenda tila yanga suge natang damar wata natang damagi chashi shenda mampu chiga ane nga suge dratang dewege ta chiga nyongzang chiwege isachi achiga wati tangdewa yoris.
So I'll go over some kind of basic landmarks because for understanding different gyri, when you look at a surface like this,
ta tada dinedo gi chingi chila tabi kapse kola ya ane kasa kogana ne ta chiga satskma sona ke chambu tinda khachungo to chiga instant dinedo tabi kapse nga suge siju tinda mambu thongres.
Because if you don't have a lot of experience looking at the brain, this all looks just like a bunch of squiggles, I imagine.
Ta chiga le pala tabi gi chingyamna shitame pa imbana dita sama ta chiga dawdo utla thwa chigorwa ade that dinedo mambu chinyam ta chi choda chi dinedo che thongres.
So I'd already mentioned that there's this central sulcus, divides right here.
Ta nga suge ta de subka chigorwa ane chiga tiwa ga subka sa chiga ko dus ma ko de tamba ta sa jute labayis.
So we have the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. And both of them are split into three major gyri. So you have this superior, middle, inferior temporal, superior, middle, inferior frontal.
That natong dama imbana natong dama la ya ko ge tumbu simla ta sha do ta tang per wo se na ta dun per jobs and the tea nothing kula yosamla yochishayores the nanshingi ngasugun dunda bimbainaya dunda telayata tang partang osledus ayosamla chishayores.
So if you remember just the superior, middle, inferior for the frontal lobe and the inferior or in the temporal lobe, then you have a basic understanding of most of the brain, at least the large gyri. Okay? So again, you can see these parallel lines like this. And you can see these lines that are kind of separating it this way. So
tanda di bayna ro nga suge dunda ta ane nathok dama ko khorang gtapcha samchi dwa ta ko la yasuje sumre tuk dwa ti sim bayna nga suge la pag na ne chashi chambu kha chi ke ta ko ge nangse ge din sen shi ge resta di bayna che suge dusta bayna ko gtapcha ti ya ko ka sugre ta khaso chi la ya ta nyamdu sigura ta nyamsigung uyo bandus tongres ro da nga sugun dunda bayna ya dunda de la ya ta ko ge tang par ta oz sum do wa ne na to da mai bayna ya ko la ya ta par ta oz dus sum cha de ta yores dus yores.
So in the sagittal view, we can see that for these parallel lines, right? These gyri in the temporal lobe, and they reflect those. So what is this gyrus right here?
Tanda nga suge dilaya shinshak namba dilata bayna nga suge di dirwa nathok dama ge ko ge nana yopi ge dirwa karsa siju dirwa siju tim bayna ko dus chingong do wa tanda gelagin zumu tsiksa shi to te siju di gares middle gyrus do you call it
middle temporal gyrus.
Middle temporal gyrus.
And what's just inferior to it?
Oh my, sir.
Inferior temporal gyrus.
That's right. What about this one?
Take it. Superior, any?
There you go.
Superior temporal gyrus.
All right, great. Now you know like all the major gyri in the temporal lobe.
That pay up with and the data on it. Because nothing them on your piggy, CG Chibua Kansas is a good service.
All right. So for the frontal, it's a little bit more difficult, but again, it's still this superior, middle, inferior frontal gyri. Okay.
Tanda sugun dundala ta bayna tis kale kapo yores yo bayna ya ko tanda suge siji tim bayna tan dunda na yo pig siji ta par oti duwa yores bayna tis kale kapo yores.
And so it's the coronal view that's often best for viewing this split if you're not viewing this kind of surface. So on the surface view you can see it. Here's the inferior, middle, superior.
Tanda dela ya chitsuge shungui ge kopandina do tago bayna ko ge tang part oti dus ngos do butong do wa ta tinda ba chi jenda ge pandina do tago bayna tanda nga su phajola yo pige tis to chusas to tiga na ne yang ko ge tanda ge siju ti tarwa tang ota par kare bate lilo tong kres.
So here I'll just point out that this is one of the gyri, this is another frontal gyri, and this is another one.
That does tabay bayna tanda de gelagten soa. Tizu ane siju res.
What gyrus is this?
Tanda gela tenge da chugu gyrus te kangre siju te kare dus.
Middle frontal gyrus. What about this one?
Jana de gares.
Exactly. And right here?
All the gares.
Great. So now, hopefully, this doesn't seem so mysterious. So you see all these squiggles, but you start to pick up on these patterns, and now we can explain, identify much of the brain, at least in this view.
Chichi bayna tanda cancer which la mathong veriwati is that is ngushin the chores that dim bayna ngasu data laya that siju data ngushin barawati sim bayna ngasuge Tonon de la yo pick up Susugura, Lepa Shingun to stop and Bana Digi Shingu to Chamachi Chesungo Shingures.
So the parietal is a little bit more difficult.
다 중답지거로 중답데 티스칼 카포요레스.
But as soon as you can identify where the central sulcus is,
다 단단가 속에 지마게 습가지거로 와티 거요메 하고서나.
and we know that posterior to it is the parietal.
되게 잡라요 파티 카레스나 중답레스.
And the major division is whether it's superior parietal lobe or inferior parietal lobe.
다 단단데라야 가서 중대요 반반나 중대글라야 중대다 가서브레 탐다 오슬레요 지그레스.
So now we're looking down at the top. You can see this, there's this sulcus here called the interparietal sulcus that divides the superior from the inferior.
다 단단데 카레스 담발라야 가서 디르와 가서 중답게 나라야도 습까지 통그레스 다 단다게 당기가 퍼텐주테 가나 마타게 세기도 와와 티게 나라야 가서 습까지 통그레스 습까티 카레스 담발라야 가서게 중답게 퍼라네비게 습까트레스.
And so there is no middle parietal, for instance. So it's just a superior and inferior. And here in this, the axial view, I've centered it on this particular sulcus that divides the superior from the inferior. So you can see it clearly right there, this particular sulcus.
단단데 퍼딜라 타파파 오프티 바나 가수들 테샤티가 남발라야니 코런 거 습까티 고수도 보건데 통고도 와스. 단단데 가수게 디르와고 시지 땅다 오든 저기 쳇버지야게 습까티.
So now that you know, so with that, and also our understanding of the occipital lobe back here, we've covered the cortical surface that we can see in this view. The one thing we can't see is, does anybody know what this part of the cortex is?
단단데 강라로 단단가 수 승대티 자로 승대티 잘라야 내가 수 당답티 데시자바인바나 가수 딜라르 문데 강라 통페게 레파게 싱위게 자시만시 슝가수 시사레스 단단다 트와치스 단다 겔라게 바 저터자서치도 dom터자서치도 데가 수게 레슝게 나네 자시 가리로에스 단다 겔라 타자서데 데가레사.
And so this is called the insula. This was actually brought up earlier this morning in terms of the taste sensation.
Insula sete lenyang marwe ra. Mara le karsa.
And so this is, we can't see it here. So it's, you would have to pry this surface apart in order to see it. So it's deep inside, so you can't see it in this view.
Langshin sula tanda de bana kondus saja dus tanda tongo mares ku thongala khathe gu yores langshin teres lingshin.
And so insula, the insular cortex, insula means island. It's kind of this island away from the rest of the brain. That's the way the neuroanatomists named it.
Taku mindila la insula se inchiti insula se te lingshin terwa lingshin roa. Tikare system la suge lepage leshin jenda li loks de yores ta insula system wala ya ngune min kares na lingthan la ko yoresa.
Okay, so we've gone over the cortical surface areas, so we can, next we'll talk about some of the subcortical structures. But are there any questions about going through, navigating the brain or identifying these major structures?
Tanda de chala nga suga lepage chisun chigoro lesson chigoro lesson te la nga suga na sta yome ta chache kare yome desi chijaba insti chela nga suga ta lesson ge ta chashi chungasa goro ta tu chong yi de ta ko ge nang sengi chashi zu de chijage insti maje ngo la ya lepa la ya ta tang ta ani lepage lesson ge tap chachi goro de ta kola twa yesa.
Hello, Jeremy. Can you please show us how to kind of maybe use with different colors, like by showing us how to use microcrogial? That would be more because this black and white image, it's confusing.
So you can,
If you had more colors, then it would be.
yeah, so there are files where you can look at with here in this Atlas gyri. They have some more colors. So the pre-central that I mentioned and the post-central, those are the motor and somatosensory cortex views.
Anda dada gila tuatri ti karsa stambalayan dus sajan dus karsa tabain baina ane karsa gunyok porach tu ni chontra kan speech tong karsa stambalay ko ganyan chi to ji dete ane chontra te ko saja tong chore doa ti tada din ane gila ge tagi ten shaim baina de ngasu tana so patay ge dirwa karsa wang luchur relation te tang gochu relation ge chi lepak chashi chi wa there is.
And so again, with the temporal lobe, you can see the inferior, middle, and superior.
Anda tanda ngasuge tirwa natong damai bana natong damalaya ngasuge ti siju ti ko teng tang partang awesome doa ti tanda dus chontamando naten yores.
So as you work with this material, it's good to practice, to start to learn them with the colors, to check and kind of quiz yourself to make sure that you're oriented and identifying the correct structure. But I highly encourage you to be able to work without the colors in order to identify the structures.
Ta tambutela ya jambi kap simbana ngasuge chontra pecho tang de tang ko khaso ten tang ta chashi ko ye me tega ruba kanda siyo me tu ngun jiala ya ani kasure chi ngun jiala tang po jambi kap se chontra pecho na ya go yore simbana ya susu ngune tang ne le pala ta tang te ge yun tu ngushia tang chashi to zu ngushia tang khaso ngushia te la ya chontra me pi gi gune ne nya chin de pecho tang thna ya go yore.
아선이 발로적디가라 차선디 쇼섬찬냠도 전바 버칭도아 만카라 디나 로버적죠 뜻간지 버적 다 리린도 있는데 세타연도 유조지요 라바는 게 리코라 따에나 다른 것을 라가송도 좀 하신
X-ray 3 dimension 돼 연구돼.
근데 지금 삼스
His question is, sometimes when we go to hospital and have X-ray or some other kind of imaging, we see that we can view a three-dimensional view of that picture. So how that imaging is done?
Like,
He's saying like the picture of the bone, or maybe like X-ray of the bone. Can we have like a three-dimensional X-ray of the bone? You can.
that's where, yeah, so you can create an image, a three-dimensional image from, you know, like you could do like a CAT scan. That's a three-dimensional X-ray, essentially. And so, and you can create, you know, kind of generate a three-dimensional image.
Mahati zua yores pertina zua yores tanda nga su CAT scan se again ko shepherd chiash to parjas to ati baina nga su ge lokper imba kash shongi simdang ge lokper tinda res ta tinda du kapse baina ko perti jabala tinda ta shongi simdang ge perti jaba baina ne shongi simdang ge nabati thont ko yores.
So this brain was generated from an MRI, right? It was generated slice by slice, but the software is creating this projection, okay? So it's not, this is a consequence of the software processing it, so we can view it in this way.
Ta de baina nga su ge duper yora duper MRI yora MRI ge ta parjagar parjas tambala lepa ge ta chashi leble chin parjagar ora bare ta parjabati parti ane nyam ta ise chi de ta chin ge nyen chi ge ta ko thamate la tu ge ta chi dibu ro chi re ma to pe ya tampu par jabati marwa parja chi de la ten de te ni thamate la ya nga su ge lepa ge ta songe samdang ge na chi ro de res parti.
니디 단다 단도다 니 지금도 바로 잡을 쳐줘라. 근데 니 나던다마다 아니 단도다 구조바로 아니 가서 단다 대한 습관도 근데 또 약간 팁작 해 주지도. 어디 진행 왠지 제 믹스해 놨어.
습관스 그러다.
단다 디 습관도 어디 팁작 해 주지도. 간 단다 가서 디 지금도 당 나타다마다 다는 든든단 구조바 잡을 지디깔라. 안데디 바로 디 텝사트 주주도 고디 그 잡을 치트고도 어디 나신다 양 단도다 지금도 제 다는 자는 나 가서 나던다 마다 지금도 단도 잡을 치고
When you talk about the frontal lobe and then the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, you have mentioned about the fissures, right? The ones that demarcate the lobes.
Yeah.
And do you have another fissure that differentiate the occipital lobe from the other lobes?
So that's a great question. There isn't a clear sulcus that divides the occipital from the temporal and the parietal. There is often, I mean, this is a bit of a detail, but there is this temporal occipital notch about right here that leads to this delineation. Yeah. But there isn't a clear one. We just, you know, it's approximately right here where there is this bend in the temporal lobe. About right here.
This is the children by na Shenda Nashing subcutting was to Puyo Maris in Vanaya, Tanda de la Nasuta Chicasco, the support of Shisha by Bana, Tanda de la Rumun dig on the Tabana, all I actually Kondo Stua, dig something in the yard or by Bana, Tandangasuka Tondepti, Nitsundega UH in Santa Chagores.
That said, in the sagittal view, near the middle, you can see a clear delineation. So you have a sulcus right here that divides the parietal from the occipital lobe. In this more lateral view, it's not as clear, but here medially, it is.
So Karsati Shinshik Kapsim, but not under per the Shendan Tongum to standard dig on the Tongo to us, Tandangasuge, Ko Singdapta, and it took them Chay, Yuachia, Subkachi or Titina, language of Tongodus.
So this is actually an important sulcus called the calcarine sulcus. And this is where the primary visual cortex is. That's what you discussed earlier this morning.
Dela Subkachi or Restroa, or Diti Karsangasu, Kechambuchakore, Gasu Dio, Tonsolation Tomachigorwa, or Digi, any Kasa Tonsoti, Sichisagalepa Chachagores.
And so, kind of to add to what was discussed in terms of the visual processing, so here you have, this is called the cuneus. It's kind of the superior to the calcarine. This is associated with processing things in your lower visual field. This is the lingual gyrus, associated with processing things in your upper visual field, because the image is essentially, or at least the inputs are flipped.
Tadangasu level at the Staba Banadilla Subkachidua, Subkadegi, Subkadilla Tenedetangasugi, Kasata, the Tonsorgalation, the Tambanilla Tangoyora, Countdown Watch to Wa. Nadina Nikas Tambalaya, Tamatigi, Nangasugi, Miki, Miglam Layo, Miki Milango, Walla Pigi, Janguti, Chatanti is a chacha, and a Walla Pigi Tigi, and a Miki Milam Gatala Pigi. Janguti Tandevi Chatting is a chigores, this Tambalayang Asuga, the Miganatele Tampu, the Mikitonlang, Ubuti Ales Tambalaya, Kugan Nanyatum, Guton Wachigorwa, Gisetin de Latin Chungores.
Okay, so for the last bit of the class, I actually want a volunteer who can come up here and show me where the hippocampus is.
This Hadeshas, the Parotelaya, and a Dini Tanglanchi head at the Dinalaya, and a Chutama coaching to stitch down to us.
Again, the Nadab de la Rimbasum Tensa again. The Rimbasum de Sama and Lebasama, the Agenda and Kashela Dindia, Rimbashito, the Yonchu Yorma, let to a Chisira. Need the Namjung of the Sotama Las Rotaning of the Gujamala, and so Lepag is such a Nijinchilla, someone at the Dire, any candidate of Pina, Kyushin is Niachic, such a Shambala, the Yomushet in Marivele.
For the temporal, he has like two questions. For the temporal lobe, you have mentioned about the gyrus, like 3 gyrus, and is that same for everybody, or is there special cases who has like 4 or like 2 gyrus?
Everybody will have those 3 gyri. It might not be as clear in everybody. like in here, it's clear right here, but here back here, it's starting to get a little bit, it's not as distinct. But generally, yes, everybody, if they're a normal brain, then yes, they would have those three. And it might be more difficult to identify in some brains versus the other.
참말라 직바 요래 심바나 카실라야 야 지금 이어지엘리라 우치 카실라 칼 카부텐다 요래 데임바임바나 땅가 수그 지금 나타데마게 코 시주 가마티임바나 원수 도브라시도 같은 마도 바임바나 코 원수 도부고는 균좀 어떻게 하더라도 디스탐발라야 참말라 요에다 스미 요래 스로가다 남지임바나 임바나야 코 원수 또 마토타 이완지 Yeah, Lil Halu Tigane Tante Yongres. And the second question is about the cortexes that are associated with the specific functions. So, is that definitive? Like, is that the same in everyone's case? For instance, someone's organs are not functioning well. So. So still we see that. So if somebody's
blind,
Yeah. For instance, someone is blind.
Yeah. So if somebody has typical sensory systems, the occipital cortex is always going to be associated with visual processing.
His question is like, if someone is blind, can that part of the brain be associated with the other functions?
Yes, absolutely.
Libiki chashi namjong azudi konzo di chik lesion nala ko di chashi di dundabre di chashi di ani khartana ta guje malare lai chashi nyeje tingi doge. Ti kansak samala dinde chibare yamena kashi ya kyen shunu sira dinde chashi de yama thuk dinde o dinde doje.
Mata tandangi drade te chibara ro pisha shapana gela karsik dostat tandangi tro thamati ta te chibasha ro pisha shana mula chonchi bana lepa thamati mu rangla dekurwe gentle pisha tangreze gentle tanda pisha tangrla so istambala tila tendre tan jona dugo pa tengdo marwe. The first part of his question is that functions in the functions associated to our organs on our brain, is it the same for everybody? For instance, like motor cortex or sensory cortex, is the same for everyone?
Like in the same location?
Yeah.
Yeah, so everybody's motor cortex would be, in the precentral gyrus. Somatosensory is going to be in the postcentral gyrus. Yes, there are the basic sensory and motor systems are very consistent across people. Yeah.
Chirgi bana jessagi tandanga suga wonser tang gochotang debige chigalepage chashi chigorwa ti mi ta chamala ta pechwala ya chisungula yores.
But as you go away from these kind of primary sensory or motor to more complex, nuanced functions, like where pain might be perceived, there's going to be more and more variability about where that is.
Hada dalandi ta ngasuga rakpasa goro ta chiu chane chapchi dorwa tile ngasu tang sapala do baina ane tang sapa tang ta chikar sagureta jeli no chau den do baina ane ko ge jeli ki chisatiya chiga nyongna chau ta chi mochla tambagi tin jongyo res.
And if you're interested in what happens when an animal goes blind and other senses take over the occipital area, my friend and colleague Sarah Pallas studies that.
Ni wampu jende ke sheli gung ulan jundwa chigarwa ti korte ngala lero chikite kola taksha chigi yores.
Pallas from University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Da de lapta ti tere dwa tene taksha chigi yores.
Tanda te dam dewan chi. Dewan de chag dungi dewa chi. Pena ta wampu
mi ko an san ro tin le chue shona ta tin yan dan chen din jua yo mara jua me on ti nam ji ta thong sur ma la ge che shi di xian ba le be che che do gres tan de le bi nin shi ga ni de shi de nang do ta de ona ka si mi ge le bi che shi ta ga non thong sur go le bi che shi de le kyun de chong mi ne ya dan chen chong de chang ma da dan chong ge shi na ani le bi che shi xian ba chi su ni thong sur karo te jawa che le chu yong me kan ni na se le bi che shi xian ba chi chu ni 남지 통솔 그 레비 체시드 아니 견전 쇼요나 레비 체시 샴바지 츠 단다 닌시 레비 닌시 제저 어딘데 친이 친 통솔 미기네 단튼 사만 쇼요라 어디 삽체메 용아요리요 말이지
If the visual system is damaged, the not visual system, visual cortex is damaged, and still we have all the visual information coming to our brain. In that case, is it possible? Is there that other part of the brain come to process the visual information? Because he's asking this because if our you have mentioned earlier, you have mentioned if our eyes become blind or the nerve that the visual nerve damaged, we can the brain, the visual system, the visual cortex can be used to do other functions.
So if if it's damaged, if the primary visual cortex is damaged in both hemispheres, then you're not getting that visual input. And so you won't, so there'll be this kind of, the gate is here. This is the gateway for where this visual information is coming in. For the most part, there are other ways for very, kind of low-level visual information to come in. But for the most part, this is the gate where the visual information is coming in from your eyes, right? And so if this is destroyed, you won't be able to see for the most part. There's nuance there, and I don't necessarily want to get distracted by the nuance, but you wouldn't be able to process what an object is, for instance.
The primary system bala thomachi gorwada so tila ya shoba imbaina ta tenga su tabaina dichagores ta tonsur gi chatun zu yongsa tan jorsa chi gorwada dichago te jiba imbaina ne ga su ge tila ya shoba imbaina ta chlono yope gi chatun tila bala jort ko yo martin stambala ya chi chala kare imbenta chi ngushya zu shit kmares ya ta tiligi ta chi zu mai ba ga jenda chi gorwada this thoya tanga te ga ne ta ya jong yores.
So since it was asked, I have a brain from somebody that I've worked with that has had damage to part of their brain here.
Ta da de la ya ke je tsang da de la ya ane lepa gi chashi chi la ya chon sho ju gi par chi ta de la ya sim ji chi ju ge adena res.
And so one of you actually brought this as a brain structure. It wasn't before, but does anybody know what this brain structure is?
Yeah? Is a temporal lobe.
So it's part of the temporal lobe. So here, which gyrus? Right? Remember, so we have this, this, and this. So which gyrus is down here?
The
inferior, I heard inferior, the inferior temporal gyrus, right? So that's part of it. And then just medial to it is another gyrus called the fusiform. And so this is part of the visual system. The higher level visual processing is damaged. And so this person has difficulty with reading words, for instance. Those are higher level, more complex visual stimuli relative to some of the more basic processing here. And so they can still see, navigate through a room, they can identify a face, identify a cup, etc., but they have particular difficulty with reading.
nga su ge tongdab chi ro tongdab de nga su tongso election nga da tongso ga na chi chitang ge tongso chi chi thoya da ta ya man da ta khaso ta ta rut ga chi ro te tak tan da ise che tres ta tan da de mi de ba na nga su ge na tong da ma ge cha chi thula du da na tong da ma ge cha chi tin la ya nga su ta chi tongso ge na ne la tis nyo zo so so ro da tin da ise che chi go res ta de gi chon shon ge mi de ba na ku nam jin thoya da su tong go res 포카리에메 다 가쇼자야 다 지고 티 싱거스 이번에 통야 통고스 이기 누스 통고여다 나 그거 딜라텐데 다 되게 다 농도 로가시 거와 뜻이트고요 말했어.
So the further back in terms of the damage, closer to the primary occipital, the primary visual cortex back here, the closer the damage would be. Again, this is another brain. You can see the calcarine sulcus here, the cuneus and the lingual gyrus, primary visual cortex. The closer it gets to damage to here, the more general the deficit in terms of visual processing is going to be.
다 단다 레벨 쇼쇼티 단다 고마테 땡 아수고 디로다 나통다 마게 데라 좀 와다 쇼쇼티 아니 가스고 땅 아수고 토미게 통솔레션 땅로와 통솔레션 더 타니르니르니르 로바요 바나 고런게 통솔고 쩐티야 지가 용차고 쳇던데 요와 어떤다로 차고 요레스.
We only have a few more minutes.
그러면 가시 질락다스.
So I can point out a few more things for navigation. Or if there are any other questions, then we can try to address those. Well, maybe I'll end with identifying the hippocampus. Kind of going through that structure. It's something that was mentioned earlier. Again, this is not the hippocampus. Right? What structure is this?
Corpus callosum.
Corpus callosum. Right. What?
You want a volunteer to show?
What? Does somebody want to?
Yeah, show.
Michi Tenga show the hippocampus is?
Yeah, Michi Tenga show side. Goyers, Tsutama.
Okay. Would you be able to? Wait. Oh no, not. Oh. I mean, I'll give you a lot of points if you can tell me what that structure is.
They got it, sir.
Does anybody know what that is?
They got it, sir.
Yeah, I thought maybe I heard it. Hypothalamus. Yes, exactly. You get 1,000 points. And then what's this?
They got it, sir.
You guys are all experts.
Thalamus, lebuche.
Okay. Right. So, but again, we need to find the hippocampus. Does anybody?
Tsutama goy there, sir. Yeah, akalokpa shoda ya. Lebu.
Oh, are you going to go? Yeah, okay, yeah. Huh? No? So it's in this view. So you can't see the hippocampus here.
Tinane tont kamaresa. Tinane tsutama thoyo mar tsutama phajukayo.
So
어, 되네.
No.
Tinana yo
it's
mari
in
phaso
here.
tinana yo resa. Sutama.
So we're in the middle of the brain here.
Alepa ki
in the
kimala yo
sagittal.
res.
You're close. Yeah, right there. Yes, exactly. There, that's the hippocampus. Exactly.
Tawjine sutama yes.
So good. I will say that you can't. This is one of my favorite structures that you can see here. So it's not the corpus callosum, but it's this white matter tract that you can see that always runs underneath it.
ta tanda ke chi teng do aten gara gashu gu tup chako te yens de maris ngasu ga lesson maris lesson go ola ya yan ko karji gi ju gu tup chachi yores.
And this is called the fornix. Does anybody know what structure it comes? It's white matter that projects from a structure. Does anybody know what that structure is?
ta de kare system bala ya ngasu ga chako chikna ne ma tön sha ju ga karji gi tup chachi res de le kare res ta chako de shinya yo sa basal ganglia, he's saying basal ganglia.
No. The hippocampus. And so let me find the hippocampus.
So tamaris ale yeah that one na.
So here you can see the hippocampus. Here's this kind of tube-like structure that you can see here in the sagittal view. And then if you follow the hippocampus posteriorly, you can see this white matter tract right here in the coronal view. This is the fornix. And if you follow it, you can see it right there. And I'm going more anteriorly. You can see it right here. You can see it right here. And then eventually it comes down, and you can see it in the sagittal view here. But this tract originates from the hippocampus and forms this kind of C shape. Okay?
The lesson go yola yo big carpu C is attached to what they only I think I suta money chonshin and do some yoris.
So I wish I had more time to go over in more detail kind of the nuances of navigating some of these structures. So this is just kind of a taste. Please reach out to me for additional input about resources, how to identify these structures. But at the end of the day, it takes a lot of practice.
Tata der wanga suge ta tisu shita mendus ruati na ne ta chesula ya chu tam goto ro je ba yes ta de kala na nga sugale pala ya chashi kanda do yo mesho kanda sta go yo me ti res ro ta de chitang ge man ta ta te nyong ta sa shu chi ro ro ne ba na ta te la ya chesuge ta ju chasena de kore te ta ne tunchen te ma pu chi yo res ro de sta bala ya ani Tamatila Karira Rally Grace Stambala de la Tata Yabushete, Jonder Kasuchima Chila Rally Gores.
Okay. And I think that is all we have time for. Please, reach out or, grab us for more questions.
That's the Taranjaresha, and the Ketisla Troy, Pataya, Chigalaya, Tonto, Yopa and Bana, and Galaya and Rochis.
Okay.